I can't remember what movie it was. I think it's the Captain Phillips, maybe, where he plays the captain of the boat that gets taken over by the pirates.
Yeah.
But I remember starting that thinking, A, Tom Hanks, B, Tom Hanks, C, it was a Tom Hanks movie. And so, but it starts off, and I think if I remember correctly, it starts off with him in a car driving somewhere with his wife. And the dialogue that they give him was so blatantly expositional, it didn't feel normal that I was like, ew. And I turned it off. So to me, exposition is filling in the reader or the viewer details they need to know before the story that they're about to see, the fragment of the story that they're about to see begins. Is that kind of how you define it?
I think you're right. It's all that stuff that happens before the story has begun that people have to know in order to understand the story. If you've got two people with a lot of baggage and you just sort of pick up from today forward without really going into that prior baggage, then the viewer who has no context is really going to lose out on the quality of their relationship, what informs this relationship, why it's so bad in the first place. And you see that a lot in movies like there's a great movie called Pieces of April. It stars Oliver Platt and Katie Holmes and Patricia Clarkson. And
Okay.
it's one of my wife's favorites. She's very partial to movies that have real high named actors, right? Like A-list actors, but they're in indie style films. Whether it's
Okay.
an indie film or not, if it just looks like an indie film, she's good. So this is one of
Right.
those. It looks like because some of it almost feels like it's on a handheld camera. I don't remember if it is or
Oh,
not, but it's a really great movie. The whole point of that story is that Katie Holmes is this fuck up, who's living in the city with a boyfriend, and she's invited her parents to come for Thanksgiving. So she's cooking Thanksgiving dinner, and everything goes wrong, right? It's a farce. Like, everything goes wrong. But it's not a farce the way Frasier is a farce, which is purely for comic effect. This has tragic overtones because the mother's dying of cancer, and this might be her last Thanksgiving. So the family, Allison Pill's in it too. She's great. I think she's
oh,
fantastic.
Alison Pill is wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful.
So, and she's very young. In fact, this is all before the newsroom. So this must have been back in like '09 or 2010 or something. It's an older movie. But anyway, the whole point of the story was that you've got this girl who's trying to make good, and the world is conspiring against her. You know, her oven breaks, and her boyfriend goes out for groceries and ends up getting beaten up, and his clothes are ruined, so he has to go get new clothes. Like, basically everything that could go wrong goes wrong, and it's not entirely her fault. She's a victim of circumstance, but everything that had happened prior to that was absolutely her fault. I think she had some drug issues, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to know about that prior history. You can't just take it from she's cooking dinner and everything goes wrong and it's a lighthearted romp. If you know the backstory and know how challenging she made her family life and how they're really expecting her to fail, and yet everything that is quote unquote failing in the present really isn't her fault, it just colors the whole narrative. So yeah, I mean, and the way they handle exposition is very clean and nice because you don't get everything dumped on you in the first 5 minutes. That's one of those things that feels very amateurish, very sophomoric when you see a story and they're like, okay, you need to know all this stuff before we go, blah, 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 blah. Okay, now we can start the story. It's like, wait, why can't we just fold that in and like learn what we need when we need it?
Yeah, sometimes it just feels like stories or films start off with like a scrolling couple paragraphs of information that you're supposed to know about some kind of weird galactic war that's going on and some shit's happening. Oh wait, that's Star Wars. Like,
Yeah, but it starts with a shootout, so that's awesome.
yeah, oh yeah, yeah, and it's a wonderful piece. Like, that's a novel way that I know that George, and at this point we can all just call him George, was taking a lot from old serials like Buck Rogers and those Saturday kind of adventures that you see at movie theaters, and maybe that was something that happened in those films, but in 1977, it was kind of a novel thing to see. So it didn't give, it just gave you a general overview of the world that we were entering. It didn't tell you, by the way, there's a kid out here on this desert planet that's got, might be the sun. It wasn't too much, but it was very well done. I am so averse to doing it wrong. I don't want to make it seem too heavy handed. I don't want to be like, filling in too many of the details that I forget information that people need to have the story. I try to be too subtle about it. And I always, always, always need to remember that the audience needs to know the world that I'm introducing to them. I mean, shit. The people that I tell, at work about what I did over the weekend need to know the world that I'm introducing. I'm just like, yeah. And so that tree came down. What are you talking about? Oh, I'm so sorry. So I have this tree, and that's my biggest problem with exposition. I have seen enough of it that I find that I don't appreciate, that I'm a little bit like wary of, or that I feel is too much, that I don't do enough sometimes.
Yeah, so I think it can be helpful if we try to put some ground rules around exposition. Again, none of this is hard and fast. What we're trying to do here for anyone who's listening is just set up kind of the bumpers on the bowling alley, just so that we can kind of keep it in the middle of the lane.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so I was thinking about exposition, and I was actually trying to think of movies that did it well, because I go to movies because it's easier, just as a context or frame of reference. It's easier for people to consume that media quickly if they want to kind of check it out. But what stories have done that well and which stories haven't done that well? And I don't know that I want to focus too much on stories that haven't done that well, because I really don't want to be that guy. So I think what we'll do is just talk about trends or tendencies that we've seen in stories that handle exposition kind of in a clunky manner. And those can be the pitfalls or things that you're going to want to avoid about exposition. Does that sound good?
Yes, it does. That sounds great. Let's do it. I'm in it.
Cool. All right. So basically, any time that you are putting exposition into your story, the time that you're spending looking backward is actually time that you're not spent moving the story forward. So if we think about it just in that clean kind of way, where it's like, all right, I'm going to take a pause for a moment. We're going to pause the forward narrative, and we're going to tell people about this thing that they need to know about. My thought is that amount of time that you're pausing should be as small as humanly possible. And so there is, as the author, we know so much of what has come, so much of what is interesting, but is it important right now for somebody to know X, Y, or Z? And I think that's, to me, the filter, because it might be nice to know a lot of those things, but is it need to know? And so if it's not need to know, then I can't put it into the story there. So that's what I like to think about. And that goes along with how much should I give people at one time. If I'm consciously pausing the story and then telling people about things from the past that influences now, then if I'm dumping a bunch of information on you, you might lose some of it, right? So the narrative isn't moving forward, and I might actually forget some of the information that you're giving me because you're giving me so much at one time. So I think those two things, just kind of keeping that in mind, can help us limit the amount of new information provided that is backward facing at any one time.
When I used to do a lot of improv back in the day, as I've said ad nauseum here, folks would always sort of be like, what are you doing this week? And I'd be like, oh, well, I'm rehearsing with the improv troupe. And they'd be like, aha, I got you. You rehearse. You're like, no. We're not rehearsing. We're not like, making sure we say the right lines or do the right gag. We're trying to get ourselves into a spot where we know what we're doing. So I feel like some folks might be like, you guys plan these podcasts out, don't you? Because I'm about to say, that brings me to this morning, Art, when I was writing another 1,600 words for the novel that I'm working on for the season that we're doing.
Congrats, first of all. Nice.
Yeah. It took an hour and 2 minutes for me to hit 1,600 words, but I was in a very big flow state. I was spending the 1,600 words that I wrote today going backwards because it's very, very easy for me at the very beginning of a process to write a longer piece And just as a sort of reminder, I've written 3 longer pieces, one that I've actually gone back to and tried to edit a little bit. The other 2, I probably will never let anyone ever see ever again in my life. I love the world building part of writing longer pieces. I love just sort of random, just shooting my mouth off, writing, because I think what that 1,600 words was today was a lot of background, was an entire history of the setting of my novel. So I'm trying to write a kind of noirish detective piece based set in a mall. I want it to be kind of funny. I want it to be a comedy kind of thing. I'm a huge fan of movies like Brick from Rian Johnson and noir films, and I just kind of want to have a lot of fun with it. I am wondering, let me ask you this. Do you think that all of the exposition that you write at the very, very beginning is very, very important, because when you start to kind of shape your story a little bit more, you'll know what you need to take out?
Yeah, I think you've hit it exactly right. And I'm really glad you asked that question, because it's a great clarifying statement. We're not talking about exposition in the drafting process. We're talking about what that final product looks like. So when your story has gone through multiple revisions and it's ready to go out to publishers, the exposition should be well chunked in small morsels and spaced out in a way that what that need to know information is provided to the reader at the moment that they need it, and not a second earlier. And that's kind of the end state, right? So starting with the end in mind, that's a really good way to do it. But during the drafting, no, I think your approach is quite solid, because I don't want to tease things that I might forget or tease things that might change. I want to just get it all down and say, well, this is the state of things, right? And vomit out, 2,000, 3,000 words on the normal world, as we talked about in our plot structure episode. That is very valuable, because once you've established that, maybe in that next draft, you don't include nearly as much of it. And in the process of writing about the normal world, maybe you come across those 3 or 4 lines that kind of succinctly encapsulate what you're trying to do, and you can space them out appropriately in your next draft so that you're getting a lot more value out of that real estate on the page. So no, I think doing it the way you're doing it is the right approach.
Yeah, and I think unfortunately, one of the things that I think I'm doing, it almost seems to be, and maybe you can disagree because I'm shooting my mouth off here because it just hit me. I'm wondering if I'm painting myself into a sort of corner, because just to be able to write a novel, which is what we're trying to do here in this season, we're just trying to write a novel that we could say, look, here's what we've done. We've done this piece. What do you think about it? Let's talk about it. Maybe season 3 will be the editing process, which for me would be season 3, 4, and 5. But for me, writing it simply and having exposition where you need it, and doing the delicate touch, and doing it so it doesn't overpower the reader, and doing it so you don't sit in the past, like you were just saying, that you're spending all that time backwards. It kind of feels like I've put myself in a bad position, because if I want to write a noir film or like a detective film, I feel like all the exposition kind of happens at the end of a noir, at the big reveal. When the detective says, this is how it was done, and I'm going to explain it, which is exactly what I want to do with this book. I love those moments in The Thin Man. I love those kind of moments where the detective finally, the green for danger. I love those moments where the detective finally reveals how the crime that the book is based around committed. I'm wondering if I'm actually right about that. I might have to think about that. The exposition kind of comes at the end, because you get all these hints of these characters doing things, and it isn't until they're assembled at the end where the detective goes backwards and gives us the exposition of how the crime was committed.
Yeah, I'll challenge that notion, because I see that as revealing elements of plot that were hidden, right?
Yeah.
And so the exposition is more about, what do I need to know about these characters, about this setting, about this world, in order to move forward, and really about the relationships between the characters. Yeah.
Right.
And that's like set up so that I can move forward and understand the narrative. So in that case, if you have the victim, right? The person who gets killed. Actually, why don't we use the movie Clue? That might be a really good one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Mr. Body, right, who gets killed. The setup in the exposition is about how all those characters have come into contact with each other and have known each other through their dealings, right?
Right.
And that is revealed, some of it's actually revealed pretty late in the film.
Yeah.
But that's the exposition that we're talking about, which is fantastic, because if you dumped all of that in the first 15 minutes and then had them running around the mansion, like the actual action of that movie, there's very little that goes on. They all come together, somebody dies, they all run around like crazy people, and then the killer is revealed. Like, not much happens in that movie.
Yeah.
So the fun of it, of course, is the performances, but it's also the comedy of the interactions. And so I think, getting back to your story, the exposition is really, who are the people involved? So you let me read a little bit of it, which I'm very thankful for, and I enjoyed what I read, and I want you to keep going. But I saw that there were a couple of people who work together, for example, who, one of whom tolerates the other. Barely, but tolerates the other. And I thought that dynamic was really exciting, because you were able to tease out that they've been working together for a little while, that here's the dynamic. And then the boss, I assume it's the boss who sort of shows up at the end of the segment that you provided, has a really nice counterpoint in the way that you've kind of shaped her not backstory, but kind of the setup of that character with who I am assuming is the victim of the story, and that they have a setup that is similar in shape but different in content, right? So like the way that you've organized, they both basically have their morning routines, and so you kind of show the morning routine of these two people who probably don't interact very much, but in the story they may have some sort of mirror, capacity, or maybe they won't, but I really like the way you did that, though. And so you're just providing all of this exposition about who they are and where they came from, and providing me really with just what I need as we progress. Because I just don't want to be lost. I don't want to be confused. Yeah. And so if at any point you have readers giving you feedback on your narrative that says, who is this person? Like, why are they doing what they're doing? Where are they, right? Those are really good indications that we haven't provided enough context, through exposition to help people understand what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. And and again, as I said earlier, I love this part of writing. It's very easy for me to start things. It's when you have to deal with cohesion and plot and making it all work. That's when I'm going to be like staring out a window, and not doing 1,000 words in 45 minutes. It's going to be like one word in 3 days, and I love giving that kind of exposition through the relationships. Dialogue, we just talked about that Captain Phillips, and how I was like, oh, this is a little bit overdone with the sort of exposition that they're giving to the national hero and icon of all time, Tom Hanks. So I really try to be a little bit more delicate about it. And this is, I think, a very big case of write what you know, because I've worked in so many places over the years in retail and service and entertainment, that you just kind of like write what you know, which are the relationships that you end up having with people at work. So yeah, whatever you've got out there, right, write about it. And then, it helps to kind of create that exposition that you need, because you know how those people are going to interact.
Yeah. And one thing you can look for is, if you've got a full narrative draft and you're starting to get the feedback of, wow, it really takes a long time for this story to get started, right? One thing you can ask your readers is, where was the point in the narrative when you felt really kind of dialed in or locked in or engaged in the narrative? Like, what part really grabbed you and made you want to keep going? And if that part is, let's say you have a 200-page manuscript, if that part is 20, 30, 40 pages in, you maybe started the book in the wrong spot. And I think we need to be able to say that to ourselves and go, did I provide too much exposition up front? Maybe I started the story in the wrong spot. And it's not that the stuff before it is unimportant, but maybe it doesn't need to be here. It can be somewhere else, So that's something else I really like to think about is, because the story can grind to a halt if you're not building character, if you're not advancing plot, if you're not applying conflict. And that's why we talked about plot and conflict and character before we got to this part of our journey, talking about exposition. It's pretty much what I'm going to try to do as I work through draft zero and then get into the actual guts of the book, is every scene has to have some kind of tension or conflict. And if it's a scene whose primary goal is to relay information about the past, I can't allow myself to do that. Because if the goal then is just a lecture class, it's a history lesson, and nobody really wants to read that, you know?
Is that the infamous whale chapter in Moby Dick?
Oh, I guess. I barely remember that book.
I think that there's just this right in the smack dab in the middle of the book. I could be wrong too. I haven't read it since this. I read it in the summer of 2009 or 2008, I think it was. But there's this chapter, and it was with a few friends that I knew at the time who had read it also. They were like, oh yeah, you can skip over it, mainly because it's about just whale history. And I think the information someone told me is just all supremely dated about whales anyway. It's like, and also whales smoke 2 to 3 packs of cigarettes a day. And it's like, no, this book was way written before science found these things out. But stopping everything just to sort of give a random history. Yeah, that's going to stop it in its tracks.
Yeah, it's, there's things that I want to do better. And I've not really ever run into this problem. But don't misunderstand me. Telling a story out of sequence, right? Playing with time isn't the same thing as providing exposition. You can have a narrative that kind of runs concurrently. Again, I'll go to television. If you've seen the show Yellow Jackets on Showtime, it's a very interesting structure that show has, because it's telling two narratives that are about, 20, 25 years apart, containing the same characters, right? The younger version of themselves and the older version. And they're both moving forward, and we don't know how either of them ends. I mean, we kind of know how the old one resolves itself, but we don't know how it ends, right? From a dramatic standpoint. And so these two narratives are kind of tracking side by side, and they jump back and forth in time. That's not an extended exposition, right? The exposition of that show would be in the first episode, where they kind of set up the fact that they all play on a high school soccer team that is about to go to nationals, right? That's the exposition. It's like, here, let me establish the setting, establish the rules of the world, introduce you to the characters, give you a sense of how these characters relate to each other. Okay, now that you know all of that, let's progress. But there's still, in each scene, there is conflict. One of the very first scenes is these two girls who are ostensibly best friends. One of the best friends, hooks up with the boyfriend of the other girl. And it's pretty shocking because of the way that it's set up. But it's a central tentpole to the relationships that move forward with that story. So, the exposition part is just the stuff you need to know, not necessarily when it occurs,
Yeah, and it's tricky to do. It's very tricky. It's not easy, which is why I'm always for overwriting. And then, you have a good friend like Arthur Franz IV, and he just kind of looks at it and says, that's too much.
Well, I think you are correct that it's a lot easier to cut than it is to add. So if you're already on that side of add up front so that you can cut later, I think that's the right way to do it. Let's talk about a few techniques of clunky exposition. This is just so that you can be mindful of whether you see this in your own work, and certainly as you're reading other people's work and you start to see these things, you can sort of point to that and go, is there a cleaner way to handle this exposition? So one of them is when you have dialogue that clearly is only there because the writer needs the reader to overhear information from two characters. And so honestly, it's characters who already know this stuff, and they're just saying it for the reader's benefit, not actually as a real conversation between the two characters. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yes.
So it would be like me going, Tim, are you ready to record our podcast about writing?
The podcast that we have been doing for over a year? Yes, I am.
Yes, the Tiffin in Writing Workshop podcast, of course. Like, how torturous, first of all, and and scene. There we go. But but no, the whole point of this is obviously these two people already know this information. The only reason to say it this way is so that people who are coming to the story from the outside get the benefit of it. There's got to be a better way to do that. So if you ever see any kind of dialogue like that, that's clearly just meant to be overheard and it's not real, fluid, natural dialogue, cut it out, and try to do it a different way. The other one is, and I see this a lot I like to call it plot point TV. So you'll have a newspaper article, right? Like the Victorian era man opens the newspaper, goes, bully, this particular thing is happening on Saturday. Well, we should go. Perhaps it'll be a great show, or something like that. And it's like, oh, okay. So this is guiding or steering the story to go to a particular direction. Or you've got characters who are like, I wonder what's happening with Kelly, and they turn the TV on. It's like, today a bus crashed over the side of a mountain. And they're like, oh my God, Kelly was on that bus. It's like, all right, really? This is what we're doing?
Yeah. Whenever there's a TV show and someone turns on the news, it's like, oh no, they're gonna get a very helpful piece of information, aren't they? Yeah.
It's so funny too, because the Edge of Tomorrow that we talked about in a previous episode actually does this, but it does it in the first few minutes. And it stitches it together, and I think it's because it does it so quickly that it actually is helpful rather than kind of clunky in a way that stands out. Because imagine if you've got a narrative, or you've got a scene between two characters, maybe they're making breakfast and they're arguing about something, and one of them turns on the TV, and this absolutely essential, critical piece of information is delivered in a full sentence, because they turn the TV on at that nanosecond. That's what we're talking about. Like, that's terrible.
Yeah, that's rough.
The other thing to look out for is really long explanatory history lessons. The one that I think of is the movie, the Dune movie, not the most recent one, but the one that was it David Lynch who did it?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So I think it was a necessary evil, because there's just so much information that you need to know about before they start that movie, that I want to say that it was the theatrical release that was like 3 hours long, had at least a 3 to 5 minute, basically like cartoon at the beginning of the story that kind of outlined, this is the Empire, this is the Emperor, this is the Harkonnen, this is this. And like it went through this whole history lesson basically before you started the forward action of the story.
Oh man, that was, look. My number one thing in the world, in this entire galaxy, is Twin Peaks. I love David Lynch and his creativity. You just got to watch it. Just as a side note, if you've never seen Jodorowsky's Dune, the documentary, you'll know why David Lynch wasn't allowed to make the Dune that he wanted to.
Oh, okay.
Oh, poor David Lynch. Yeah, he just doesn't. He tried. I think he actually tried to get his name removed from that film.
Oh wow.
Anyway,
okay, yeah. Well, I want to say in the theatrical release, like the one that most people saw, there wasn't that chunk of exposition up front, but it created confusion in the audience. So I don't remember, look, I'm not an expert, I'm not a film historian, I don't remember which one was released, which one came first. I just remember seeing both versions, and I was stunned, because when I saw the one with all the exposition up front, I'm like, oh my God, this is a lot of information. But when we got through it, I was like, oh, I didn't know most of that. That's pretty cool. So, it was important information. I just didn't want it given to me in that manner.
It's actually very, very funny. I took my mom to go see Quantum of Solace, the James Bond film starring Daniel Craig. And I believe that there were some issues surrounding it. I can't remember what was going on about that film that didn't make it as strong as some of the other Daniel Craig films. But I remember at one point in the movie, I think James Bond and his traveling partner, the young woman who was with him, they crashed and they landed in like a cave or something. And they started talking. And I was like, oh, geez, James Bond's talking to a woman. I know where this is going. So I went, hey, Mom, I'm going to the bathroom real quick. Go to the bathroom, 3, 4, 5 minutes. I come back. I watch the rest of the film. And I'm just like, what the hell was that movie about? I don't even know wait a minute, what was going on? It was because the moment that I figured James Bond was going to try and hook up with the woman of the film, that turned out to be the most important expositional piece of the entire thing, where they discovered the bad guy's plot in the cave. So I missed everything that would have made the movie make sense to me because I went to the bathroom. So be careful where you place it.
That's a shame. And they didn't reference it again at all. It's like, psst, by the way, you need to know this.
I think it was like, this is why I don't remember. I just remember leaving that movie and being like, wow, that was weird. What was going on there? And then I tried to piece it together, and then I saw it again and I was like, oh.
Yeah. Well, the
Yeah.
long history lesson thing, I'm really thinking of books that have more of a medieval flair, maybe like fantasy books, because I'm aware of books that really will take their time and kind of tell the lore of the land and start to sort of delve into family trees and things like that. It's not that that's bad, but you just need to be critical, think critically about that. Is this absolutely essential at this moment in time? Is this the best way to express, this information? So I actually have some questions. I've got 4 questions that you can ask yourself when you are planning on presenting exposition. And I think these 4 questions can help with making sure that we're providing just the right amount of information when we start wanting to do that. So the first one is, what history does the audience need to know at this moment to not feel lost in the story? And so for me, that's the difference between kind of seeding mystery in a story versus people just being confused, right?
Yeah.
Because you want to have that kind of, the audience lean in, the reader kind of lean in and go, what is happening here? And that sense of mystery, that sense of I want to figure out what's happening, will pull them through the book. That's the tension that helps pull them into the next scene.
Yeah, and that it's also very funny because that extra 1,600 words I wrote this morning were definitely a long history of the mall that this story is taking place in. And I kind of tried to use it as a way of introducing a couple more characters. But I just love, again, going back to David Lynch a little bit, I know that one of his early ideas about Twin Peaks was just having a TV show where they continually put out these sort of red herrings and that the Laura Palmer's murderer would never be discovered. It was just a series of red herrings and these, tracing this sort of white rabbit to try and unlock these mysteries that only unlocked further mysteries. So, I love placing those kind of things in histories or in narrative parts, but, I'm not David Lynch, so I better keep an eye on that, and I'll have to probably go back and edit it just a little bit, that long history of mine.
Well, the history can be fun, right? And sometimes having an aside that sort of tells a story within the story can be really beneficial.
Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon?
I actually don't remember that film very well.
Oh, there's I think it's in the very middle of that film, there's like an entirely other film that gives a little bit of background. So yeah, it's very fun. It is fun to kind of do. Yeah, sometimes. And it can be done very interestingly too.
Yeah, there's in one of the Harry Potter films, I don't remember which, but it's the one that introduces the Deathly Hallows. So maybe it's Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. But there's, I'm like, it's really dumb now. But anyway, I just remember that I haven't read the books, but I've seen the movies. And in the movie, there was this aside that was basically a fable, right? And they told this fairy tale. And it was this animated fairy tale in the middle of this live action movie. And it worked perfectly. It was so good because it demonstrated, the piece of the lore that mattered, that they had to know about to move forward, and it identified people who sort of connected with this mythos, and it allowed the main characters to identify people who were threats to them because of the particular sigil that they wore. So it did a lot of work, but it did it in a very entertaining way because you got this story time in the middle of this live action narrative that was engaging. So again, the story itself wasn't just a history lesson. Now turn your books to page 28 and we will talk about the history of so-and-so. Yeah. It had tension. It was a good story. So I think if you're presenting the history of the mall, for example, in your thing, just look at, is it a story within the story that conforms to those same guidelines? Does it have conflict and tension? Does it have a beginning, a middle, and an end? I think if you take a look at it again on a revision with that in mind, then you'll have this kind of capsule of really interesting backstory that's presented in a way that still moves the story forward.
Yeah, and I think that again in this early part of writing this book and trying to get it, it's very good, I think, to just, for lack of a better term, just vomit it all out, just write everything. Because, I was spending that time writing today and finding other, the seeds of other ideas within that within that piece that I was writing. And it was a lot of fun. And that's what's really, really great, I think, about initial draft exposition, is that you're sort of like getting your sea legs. You might have an idea of who your main characters are going to be. You might have an idea of what the plot is going to be. You might have an idea of how you want the story to feel. But there are a lot of ideas that you're going to need. And I think that writing as much as you can and having fun with it and letting yourself follow these little tributaries that might go a little bit away from what you were thinking can only lead to more ideas. Some of them, maybe a lot of them, will end up shriveling up and they're not really good diversions. But if you can start with a lot of exposition, like you said a little bit earlier, it's easier to cut it than to try and have a paucity of ideas.
Yeah, either cut it or you reshape it into something that creates conflict and has purpose in the story. So that was actually the second question. So the first one was, what history does the audience need at this moment to not get lost in the story? The second one is, what is creating tension or conflict in this scene? And if you read the scene and you're like, well, there really is no tension or conflict here, it's really just relaying information, then the scene's not working hard enough, and you've got to figure out a way to make it work harder. And that might be, this is too much information for one scene. Let's break it up into pieces and kind of dole it out or dribble it out in the course of the natural story. If I provide too much backstory, it may actually undercut the amount of mystery that there is, and that mystery is what's pulling people through the story. So maybe if I kind of withhold some of that information and dole it out later, then I can keep that sense of mystery high, reveal what's necessary at the moment the reader needs it, which then, continues the story and keeps that tension high. So that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. That's something too that I sometimes hear from authors, and that I really need to go back to, is each scene having to have some kind of like a little bit of tension, the conflict, or, driving the scene forward instead of letting it sit. And that to me is also a lot of fun, like creating every single chapter or every single segment of a chapter and being like, could this stand on its own somewhere? Obviously, I am not a talented enough writer to have that happen, but it's something to strive for, to make sure that you don't have any just throwaway scenes, because if it's a throwaway scene, you don't need it. It probably doesn't need to be there. You need to have that tension or conflict to make it something that's going to propel people forward.
Yeah, and I've talked about stories that like they put their boot on your throat and they just don't let up. And sometimes those are hard to deal with. So I think there's a natural tendency for folks to say, well, I need to give my reader a break. So I'm going to give them kind of a softer scene that doesn't have any tension at all, just so that they can have a breather. I think it's necessary to give the reader a breather, but I don't think you want to have a scene that has no tension. So if you have, like Shakespeare does this really well, where you've got these really intense scenes in the dramas that are then offset by these purely comic romps. I think of the gravedigger scene in Hamlet, where it's like this guy's just poured his guts out to the skull. I'm pretty sure this is the order it happens. And then the very next thing is, these gravediggers are like, what's that? Or actually, it might be reversed. It might be the gravediggers came first, and then he pours his guts out to the skull. But regardless, he juxtaposes those two things to give the viewer, because it was a play, give the viewer a break, a breather. Because if you just keep relentlessly hammering them with sorrow and pity, it's tough, So that counterpoint is really helpful. But he's still using that gravedigger scene to provide information that's relevant, as well as comic relief and kind of a break.
Yeah, and I think that's something, when my favorite heavy bands are ones that understand that folks need a moment to breathe. I know there are folks out there that love metal that just kind of goes from the first second of the first song to the last second of the last song, where it is straight on 45 minutes of da 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 da. Great, I love that. But my favorite bands are ones that allow you to breathe, that know that you can have tension also in quieter moments, that you need to take a pause. And I love works that do that as well. And I think that, again, returning to David Lynch, I think that he does that exceptionally well throughout Twin Peaks, where there are these very, very serious moments of both normal, regular, everyday person-on-person horror cosmic horror, all of that, but there's a lot of humor in it. And I think that that's very important. That's the thing that I like using the most is humor to kind of give you a little bit of a break in between. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the first question we asked, what history does the audience need to know at this moment, how they're not lost in the story? The second one, what is creating tension or conflict in the scene? My next question is, does it need a whole scene? Right? Do I need to provide a giant chunk of exposition at this moment in time? Does it take a whole scene? And sometimes it does, right? Again, these aren't hard and fast rules, but these are just questions I think are really important for us to ask ourselves. Because if the answer is, yeah, it does need a whole scene, well, then it does. That's okay. But many times we might think that it should take a whole scene, but if we look at it critically, we'll go, well, maybe not. And so the idea is to just parse out into small bites, and sometimes you can intersperse these little details inside of scenes that already have forward action, and it's a lot richer of an experience for the viewer or the listener or the reader to experience it that way, because it's almost like they're investigating and they're picking apart the answer and kind of solving the riddle as you move the story forward.
Yeah. One of the things that I really love about Kafka, and that kind of pushed me towards the writing a lot of the microfiction that I do in smaller pieces, is that I love to get as much as you can out of as few words as you can. And I think that if you want to, for me personally, when I really want to try and find out how to do more details in a smaller amount of time so that I can give more action to, so that I can give more time to action or forward momentum, is looking at microfiction, is looking at smaller pieces. How much can you say about a character in as few words as possible? Can you say it through dialogue? Does it need a whole scene, or can it just be one line of dialogue? I love challenging myself in that way. Can I give away a character in one line of dialogue? I think, one of the things that I've been thinking about is I'm introducing my main character in the novel that I'm working on now. Madeline Tin is the name of the main character. And all of this novel, as a side note, came from my partner. She was digging through our cabinets looking for her Madeline tin, because, yes, she's that kind of baker that she has a Madeline tin. I was like, that would be a great name. And so the first line of dialogue, I think, is so important for a character, especially if it's a main character. And so, yeah, do I need a whole scene to introduce my main character? Or can I do it with one line of dialogue? I think that those are the fun things to try and unravel about when you're trying to write something. I think it's my favorite part. I love it.
Yeah, and dialogue is a lot of fun. We're going to get to that very soon and have its own episode about dialogue. But that's where the whole attacking, defending piece of dialogue can sort of instantly inject conflict into your scene. But we'll get to that on a different day. All right, good.
Oh, good.
Yeah, no, it'll be fun. So the last question that we've got, does it help to contrast the current state against how things used to be? So the idea here is that if you can sort of show the way it used to be and the way it is now and how those are different in a very small package, then it helps paint the old world in terms of the new world. The classic example is, some grizzled, detective on the police force, had his wife was murdered and he was in the line of duty. And if he had only been home, she wouldn't have been killed, but he was on the job. And so now he resents his job and all this other crap. You can present that as a contrast of the way he used to be when, before that incident occurred and the way he is now after the incident occurred. And that contrast very cleanly sets up this, polarization of the past and the present.
Yeah, I think of Solaris, which is a wonderful film. It's the only movie that I watched. I'm talking about the George Clooney one, and I'm sure there's someone out there who likes the original Solaris and is rolling their eyes and turning us off now. Sorry about that, Art. But the George Clooney Solaris is really wonderful. The exposition there is done so very nicely. It shows us that George Clooney had a relationship that she has passed on, and he is kind of trying to live through his life as it is when we first meet him, which is without the love of his life. It's really, really well done. And I encourage anybody to go check it out. It's a very nice, delicate touch of exposition that kind of touches on the one that you just talked about with the cop in the line of duty that lost his wife.
Yeah, well, the thing about contrast is that it provides ready-made conflict, because you've got the way things used to be and the way things are, they are different. And so when you kind of put them next to each other, that juxtaposition often creates a little bit of tension and a little bit of conflict. And it kind of sets up very nicely, what's at stake or what's in play. So that can be really helpful.
Yeah.
I hope people get value out of those. Like the 4 questions, I've tried this before and I like the results. So I'd love to hear back from anybody who tries it. But let's stop talking about that and start talking about your book.
Well, it's pretty, to be perfectly honest, and I think that's what I really like about talking to you, is because I could say things like, I'm not really sure I could define exposition, but I know it when I see it. I think that's is that the Jesse Helms pornography line?
Yes.
I can't remember who said that.
Yeah.
And so this has been helpful to me, because I think in listening to it and listening to it again, I just need to get a better sense of it, because I really like exposition, but I think it's the exposition as I understand it. So having these guidelines, I think will be very helpful. And it's kind of things that I think I want to say, the things that I know instinctually as a writer, saying that, I feel like that makes me sound like a supreme asshole that has a lot of experience in writing. And while I do, it's not as a successful writer. And as a successful writer, what I mean to say is a cogent history of stories where I feel like I'm like, okay, this is good. I really like what's going on here. So I can take this all with a grain of salt, but it's very helpful to have you doing this work so that it's like, oh, that's exposition that I've been talking about all this time? Oh.
Yeah. I've been really enjoying the research and the consolidation process that we're undergoing, because we've got the 10 topics within the competency map, and I think we're on our 4th of the 10.
Yeah.
And these are things that I may have taken for granted, and I do recognize when exposition is done poorly, but I couldn't articulate when or why or how I knew that. So just putting a little bit of critical thought to it and kind of consolidating some of my thoughts really helps. And then what we are doing with the refills is really kind of capturing this in a more succinct verbal essay. And what I've found really helpful is in the drafting process, I go back to those refills. I do like to listen to the long conversations as well, because we do kind of dive deep on some things, but the refills are super helpful to go back and refresh on character, on plot, on conflict. And that's something that I do regularly, especially when I'm preparing to write a scene. If I know that I've blocked out an hour and a half to write and I'm like, I really got to make this time valuable. I might, spend the 3 to 5 minutes listening to the refill just to kind of prime the pump. It's good.
Yeah. And I'm saying such, the thing about it too is that being with exposition, I mean, that's just the part of the novel that I'm starting off with right now. Like I said a little bit earlier, it's very easy for me to write because, world building is so much fun.
Yeah. And you have to know what you're talking about. Like, you can't just start with the narrative and go, okay, I'm going to write just the tension and just the conflict, and the rest, the rest of it will just magically fall into place. It's like, no, you have to do all that grunt work and that legwork to do the whole background or backstory of these characters and why they matter and how they intersect and what might happen in the future. And then when you come back around and start doing a real draft again, then it's a narrative that people can consume. It's a story that's paced appropriately, and you're, doling out little snippets of information at just the right time to make sure that people aren't drowning in backstory. So no, I mean, you're doing it the right way. I'm really excited about the progress, because again, thank you for letting me read work in progress. And I told you that my gift to you is that I will give you 0 feedback. So I'm sticking with that gift. Just keep going, because I'm really engaged. I'm interested in knowing what happens to these characters, and I can't wait to read more.